I want to do a video on the catching position. Quite frankly, I think it might be the most misunderstood position on the field, mostly because the techniques that are being taught are changing. And as are most things in baseball, they change from a top-down structure. So whatever's taught at the highest of levels gets pushed all the way down to the bottom, and yet some of those folks at the bottom are questioning what it is that they're hearing. So I was a catcher. Like George Gervin used to say, he could finger roll. The one thing I could do is I could catch and throw. I wasn't really a great hitter, but I could catch and throw. It's why I got an opportunity to play some professional baseball. But in that respect, I'm always questioning what it is I teach, because sometimes I think the people that do things real naturally have a hard time expressing what it is that should be done. So just because I was a really good catch and throw guy doesn't mean or doesn't qualify me to be the best teacher of the position. And I think there's some really good teachers of the catching position out there. But having said that, I could catch and throw. So one of the things I want to do is talk about maybe what I did, what I taught, and now what I teach. So when I was playing the game, I graduated high school in 91, college in 95, and played 1 year in the Angels organization. And the catching position, you're asked to do four things. You're asked to think the game, and that is a really neglected piece of the position when coaches take that responsibility from catchers. I think one of the reasons why catchers make great coaches is because they're constantly thinking the game, and they're thinking the game despite going 0 for 2 with 2 strikeouts. A ton of discipline to play this position well, to think this position all the time. You got to think it, you got to catch it, you got to block it, you got to throw it. Now, of those skills, the thinking piece has been removed a little bit at the amateur level, which is unfortunate. But of those next three, think of it in terms of what the position offers. And receiving it or catching it is basically trying to get that guy on the mound what he deserves, right? So if I'm a good receiver of the ball, essentially what I'm doing is I'm getting the pitcher every pitch he deserves. If I'm a good blocker of the ball, essentially what I'm doing is I'm saving the pitcher from some of his errors or some of his errant throws. Okay, and if I'm a good thrower of the ball, basically what I'm doing is I'm preventing the opposition from taking advantage. So if I were prioritizing skills from the catching position, I would say you got to be able to receive it, you got to be able to block it, you got to be able to throw it in that order. And yet at the top down, when we impose our catching principles, the only thing we really measure is pop time, which means we're placing our throwing above our blocking and above our receiving, and that isn't the case. That should not be the case. But I guess what's assumed is if you make it to the top, you can catch and you can block. But it's something you want to be aware of. So let's back up and let's talk about how I did it back in the 90s. So back in the 90s, what I remember being always obsessed about with receiving of the ball was this knee and this elbow, and I was always fighting for space because all the other stuff I could handle. Now, what I did is I was constantly framing the ball, and they don't talk in terms of framing anymore, but back in the 90s they did. They taught us to frame pitches, and framing pitches was a pretty demonstrative act, but they don't talk like that anymore. But I do remember when I would catch lefties with good breaking balls or right-handers with good two-seamers, I was always fighting for space with this knee and this elbow. So what I would do is I would always kick this knee in and work outside the knee. Now, I'm not a really tall guy, wasn't really big, So some of your larger catchers, what I saw them doing is I saw them clearing that space inside. I wasn't that guy. I could clear that space by moving my knee in. So that's how I receive the ball a little bit better. I would kick my knee in and I would work for space this way. Now, what I would also do is I would drop this left knee to work underneath pitches. And I found myself doing it on curveballs from righties. So if I called a curveball from a righty and I knew it was breaking in this direction, what I found myself doing was dropping to a knee and really trying to beat that ball to a spot. And when people would ask me why I was doing it, I would say, well, I feel like I'm centering the ball in my chest. In other words, if I just catch it out here, it looks like it's outside my body, but as I drop that knee and really try to work through that thing, it looks like I'm trying to center it. That was my rationale for doing it. I got pitches, like it worked for me. I got pitches. I don't know if that was the reason why or not, but that's what I said, okay? So that's the way I caught. I was pretty good. I could catch it. But then I became a coach, and then sitting from the bench, I started to observe things. And this whole idea of framing the ball, that wasn't going to suffice. Framing the ball, there's too much movement, there's too much manipulation. It's not authentic in any way. So what I started saying was you got to beat the ball to a spot. And then that became my new language. What I taught was I said you had to beat the ball to a spot. And what that meant was if the ball was on this side of the plate, you got to work outside of out or inside of in, depending on your perspective. And you had to beat it to a spot. You had to beat it to a spot. You had to beat it to a spot. Work lower than low. Work higher than high. Work outside of out and work inside of in. The other thing that I said is hey, if you need to clear space with that elbow and that knee, drop your knee. Like go ahead and actually work from this position, right? And that was comfortable for me as a catcher. Now, it wasn't in vogue in the 90s like it is now, or even like it was in the early 2000s. But it was something that I started to believe in, that you could actually become a better receiver of the ball if the knee was on the ground and you could beat the ball to a spot and you gave the umpire good vision from behind you. But again, the manner in which I taught the position, I learned this term later, but they call this steering wheel. They call this a steering wheel, right? So you work lower than low, but you're working at a thumb at 12 o'clock on this pitch all the way around, and you're trying to beat the ball to a spot. And that's how we would present the ball to the umpire. And that's pretty much how I taught receiving in the early 2000s. And quite frankly, it seemed to work. It resembled what I did. A lot of my catchers liked it. In talking to the pitchers, a lot of the pitchers liked this idea. You know, we would use the phrase "stick it." But then the position has really started to evolve now, where there's so much. I'm not going to say confusion, and I don't even want to admit I don't have all the data, and potentially the data suggests that there is an optimal way to catch pitchers at the big league level. So what I'm seeing now is it looks rather uniform that coaches prefer these knees on the ground. What I'm hearing, one of the reasons why they like it, is because when you put your feet on the ground, now the umpire potentially has a frame of reference with your knee, which means any ball that disappears below the knee is a ball. But if you can drop a knee and you can remove another knee from frame of reference, now they don't have this bottom of the zone, right? So potentially that might be a reason to confuse an umpire, to manipulate an umpire. It's what I'm hearing in some circles. I do love the idea of a drop knee. When I catch bullpens now, I definitely can see the advantage of working lower than the ball and working up through it. They talk about moving the ball now. The one thing that has always been a question for me is that thumb position. Because when I was catching, if I put my thumb at 6 o'clock and I got a two-seamer from a righty or a curveball that broke more than I wanted, I never really could figure out how I was going to protect my thumb. But regardless, I'm not teaching at that highest of level now, but they want that thumb lower and they want to work up this way through it. This seems to be an accepted method at the highest of levels. Here's a concern that I have. When I work with high school catchers, what I now teach them is I share with them what is being taught at the highest of levels. If they've got a really good foundation and there's a chance that they could play professional baseball, I make them aware of what's being taught. But then I make it really clear that at the professional level, what professional catchers are trying to do is they're trying to turn this pitch into a strike. They're trying to turn this pitch into a strike. They're trying to turn this pitch into a strike. They're living on the margins and they're trying to take those pitches and make them presentable options to be called a strike. If you're catching at the high school level, potentially the college level, your pitchers in all likelihood don't have that kind of command. And what that means is if you're going to get comfortable and you're going to lock in and you're going to set right here with the expectation of working through every pitch, I would ask you, are you prepared to handle this pitch? Are you prepared to handle this pitch? Are you prepared to handle this pitch? Because you have to know that big league catchers also have big league pitchers. And if you're charged with catching a staff and being the catcher on a high school team, one of your responsibilities is to not let balls go to the backstop. And it isn't a given that every pitch is going to be in this relative area. So if you are in fact going to work this way, but he throws you a ball out here, it's obvious what your glove's going to do. Your glove is going to turn and go catch that ball. And I guess all I would say is what I teach now is I teach a steering wheel method, beat the ball to a spot, make it presentable, but I also inform them that the technique, in all likelihood, as long as the data still says it's a preferred method, that there's a chance that you're going to want to consider a different technique. Now, again, I hate predicting the future because technology could make this position totally obsolete, where all you have to do is just, throw guys out and the actually receiving of the pitch becomes obsolete if the strike zone gets automated. But so long as the position demands some nuance where this position still values receiving of the ball, I want to just talk about how catchers best do that. And so to wrap it up, I guess the way I did it was a framing idea. The way I taught it was beat the ball to a spot. And now what I teach is still basically beat the ball to a spot, but just with an understanding that this idea of working below balls potentially could start to influence umpires at the highest of levels. I believe that's why they want it. I believe that's why it's being taught. We haven't got into throwing and didn't get into blocking. We just talked about receiving, but it's a very nuanced position. It's a position that's tough to evaluate, but that's how I tackle the catching position with respect to receiving the baseball.